Hello everyone, welcome back to Extract the Fact. I'm your host, Adam Israelovitz. So I'll be visiting friends and family in Israel for the next 3 weeks or so. So unfortunately I won't be able to film for a while, Extract the Fact. So I'm excited to bring you guys this topic today, and hopefully in 3 weeks or so I'll resume. But hopefully this topic will be good so you guys have a lot to talk about and have a lot to watch until I get back. But I'm excited to bring you guys this topic today, and that is, should churches in the United States remain tax exempt? So there have been changing tides about this issue. As we see in a Forbes article, both Zimbabwe and Italy have agreed, or Zimbabwe is in discussions now, and Italy has agreed to begin taxing churches ever since 2013. So tides have been changing, and this policy of churches being tax exempt in the United States has been a constant in American policy for over 200 years. And now it's interesting to see both sides of this issue and whether this might change or why the arguments are the way they are. So first, I'll be arguing that churches should remain tax exempt. The government should not be taxing churches. And on the other side, we'll say no, churches are not above the law and they should be taxed fairly. So first, on the yes camp that churches should remain tax exempt, a core argument is that if we tax churches, the government would be empowered to penalize or shut them down if they default on their payments. So if the government demands taxes from the church and the church can simply not afford or simply pay the government the fair tax, then the government can shut down the church. And this is seen as a suppression of religion. So if taxed, the government could hold leverage or a monetary incentive over the church or the religious institution, which could prompt a shutdown. Now, procon.org says that also, this is a more social component, that many inner city families that are a Christian center rely on churches to provide food and clothing, and this would be stripped or relegated to a cap-strap local government if governments that don't have resources. So in inner cities that the governments there are not properly funded and there are not enough resources to support poor families in the inner city, churches are relied on as this kind of social group that provides food and shelter and clothing and all this basic necessities of life. And if taxes are brought in, then the church will not have that funding to spend directly to help their people in their community. Instead, we'll be giving it to local governments, which is that, and these governments cannot afford or cannot sustain the charity growth that the church has. Another interesting point is that, as I said before, U.S. churches have been tax exempt for over 200 years. Now, America is not considered a theocracy. Nobody thinks of it that way, and it's hard to see something changing like that. So a lot of people will say, well, there's a huge contrast. Why are we keeping churches exempt? I thought religious toleration is a hallmark here, and we're giving a clear incentive to churches, but actually there is no sign of America becoming theocracy. In other parts of the world, there are theocracies, but America is not one of them. In addition, small churches that are already struggling to survive, again, the heart of middle America, these little churches that are popped up in little communities that serve as the basis for culture and the basis for giving back to the community, these small churches that are already struggling to survive in today's climate would be further endangered by a new tax burden. So many argue this harms the fabric of American culture. As I said, churches are always the hallmark and usually a cultural unifier. Even though America is increasingly not Christian, there is still a huge emphasis on the church in American life, and to see it being the church is paying the government instead of giving back to their community kind of contrasts this cultural ideal. On the other side, we can argue that no, churches should not be tax exempt. The government should tax churches just like any other institution, and that's the way it should be. So a core argument here is tax exemptions for churches violates the separation of church and state. It is a staple of the First Amendment that we are not supposed to intertwine church and state, and it seems clear here, just on the basis of a religious practice, that we are giving a monetary incentive to the church, saying, hey, if you are a Christian or if you practice a faith that the government believes in, you do not have to pay taxes, which seems totally contrary to what the separation of church and state means. While this is not religious persecution, which is the original point of many settlers coming to America, the idea of monetary incentives for practicing a religion seems counter to the Constitution. In addition, tax exemption is a privilege. It's not a right. So we are not a religious state or a theocracy, and it's not enshrined in our Constitution to expect these kind of rights. So many people argue, we have to not taxing our churches is a right. We must protect the church and protect religion. Well, that's not true because we're not a religious state. We are not a theocracy. We're a democracy that protects all religions. So it is a privilege, and that privilege should be assessed duly. In addition, we have to look at all different perspectives. So when the church is not paying taxes, that means other people have to cover for the church. And other people include, for example, atheists and those who do not support religion are forced to pay taxes on religions and specifically on churches. So why should someone who disagrees with the church or someone who does not support the views of the church, why should they be paying for them and paying for their services even though they deeply disagree with their beliefs? That doesn't, if you're an atheist, you shouldn't be funding a church, is what many of people of this argument would claim. In addition, this is an interesting kind of a political angle here. People argue if churches are tax exempt, that it actually restricts political rights. So if you have a government or a local official saying, hey, you don't have to pay taxes here, the pastors will not be able to speak their minds on the issue because, let's say, the local government, who the pastor does not support, but they don't pay taxes to the government, they feel they can't speak their mind because if they do, there might be a problem where they might be taxed, and then there's a whole cycle of if the church can afford to pay this tax and what happens to the church, so they feel restricted because of this tax exemption. Now, if everyone paid taxes to the government regardless, there wouldn't be this issue. And it's because they're not tax exempt. It's kind of like the government can hold something over the church, no matter what political affiliation they are. In addition, from Reagan versus Taxation with Representation, which is a court case in 1983, it says, quote, a tax exemption has much the same effect as a cash grant to the organization of the amount of tax it would have to pay on its income. So this is saying that government is barred by the Constitution to subsidize religion, and by this interpretation above, tax exemptions can be considered subsidizing religion. So in this court case, it says that essentially what it boils down to is that a tax exemption is a subsidy, and it is illegal to subsidize religion in the Constitution. So by that logic, many people argue that it is illegal under the Constitution to be exempting these churches from taxation. In addition, there's an argument that exemptions are obviously a high privilege. It's not something that many people get a chance to do, or many institutions have this privilege of exemption, and they should be restricted to facilities that help the government achieve their functions. So for example, homeless shelters and hospitals aid the government in something that the government would have otherwise had to do on themselves. So instead, as a reward, these hospitals, these private hospitals and these private shelters, for example, would not be taxed by the government because they are aiding the government's job. Now, the church is not aiding the government's job. The government wouldn't have a religious there would not be a Christian sect of the government devoted to religion if the church was abolished. So they think, according to that logic, that churches should not be tax exempt because they're not directly aiding the function of our government. One final point is this is just one example, obviously, so this is not, don't take this on the macro scale, this is just one specific instance. There's a lot of tax money being lost just on a pure number standpoint. So for example, New York's nonpartisan independent budget office determined in July 2011 that New York City alone lost $627 million in property tax revenue from these churches. So obviously, New York City, pretty big place with a lot of churches, so this is obviously a huge figure, but it's interesting to point out $627 million based on this loss in tax revenue is obviously a substantial figure, so just keep that in mind when you're making your decision. So I thought this is interesting. I think this topic, it's not talked about in the mainstream media a lot. I'm not sure why, because it seems like this would be a hot topic, and it seems like I'm not sure if it would divide on partisan lines, but I feel like there would be obviously a fiery support for and against, I can see here already. But I think it's interesting just because, as I said before, the Zimbabwe and Italian governments have already examined this issue, and I think eventually, as we've seen with a lot of other issues, that Europe has pioneered or Europe has explored it, and Canada as well, it may seep into American politics soon after. So I think it's important to cover, and who knows, maybe in a year or two this will be a primary issue in the, let's say, the 2018 midterm elections, the 2020 presidential, or the 2022 midterms again. So I think it's interesting to talk about. So let me know what you guys think. I'll be back in around 3 weeks or so with another video, but from then, hold tight, and thanks for watching, guys.